So welcome back to Half Past Capitalism, where we talk about alternatives to capitalism as if they were possible. This show is part of the Harbinger Media Network and is sponsored by SEAS, that's the Solidarity Economy Incubator for Zero Emissions here in Montreal. Today we're speaking to Shannon Ikebe, a professor in humanities at John Abbott College. He's a veteran of the student movement, a labor activist, and the author of a very interesting dissertation about the Meidner Plan and Sweden's wage earner funds. And his research is based on recently released archives, so they have some potentially new insights and lessons. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So we just did an episode about the Meidner Plan, and I guess before we jump into it, can you just give me an overview of what your sort of recent research was about?
Thank you. So I did my PhD dissertation entirely on the Swedish wage earner funds. One of whose versions was for the workers' funds, union funds, to gradually overtake the shares of the corporations to get us to worker majority ownership and of the democratic socialism. And so I looked at all the important relevant archives in Sweden to figure out what actually happened and the rise and fall of the social democratic path to socialism.
Great. I mean, I think for me, what's in one of the things, and it's such a fascinating piece of history, but I think one of the things that's enticing about the Meidner Plan or the sort of associated idea of transitioning, to worker ownership over this sort of gradual period is that it suggests the possibility of a sort of peaceful and gradual transition from capitalism to democratic socialism. So I guess, before we jump into the specifics, from your research, do you feel like that possibility was ever on the table in Sweden?
Well, I think there were structural constraints. I think it was pretty difficult. And, even though it was attempted, and if many things had been different, I think it might have had a better chance. But, it did not work. So I think the Swedish story mostly tells us the shortcomings and problems that such a path can face.
So let's talk about those shortcomings and problems. I mean, you've mentioned the business opposition to the Meidner Plan, but you were saying that there were some shortcomings that happened even before that opposition kicked in. What were those issues?
That's right. So I think when it comes to studying the wage earner funds, I think it is very important to separate the two very distinct kinds. And one is the one that gets us to worker majority ownership, democratic socialism eventually, and the most other kinds of such funds that do not get us to such a point, and in fact are often explicitly precluding such a democratic socialist option. And when it comes to this, what they call the Meidner-Hedberg plan, it was written and decided on by two union economists, Rudolf Meidner and Anna Hedberg. And this plan was proposed in 74, decided on in 74, publicly released in 1975, approved by the Union Congress in 1976. But it was over politically by 1978 or so, and it was actually before even this massive capitalist counter-mobilization had begun. And so this plan didn't actually even get to the point of this frontal confrontation between the working class and the capitalist class, so to speak, and it was defeated within the social democratic institutions, one mainly due to, of course, the strong opposition of the Social Democratic Party leadership. And even though it had a strong support from the grassroots workers, the forces in support of the Meidner-Hedberg plan were not sufficiently organized to push it further against the strong opposition of the Social Democratic Party leadership.
The Social Democratic Party, which is obviously quite far to the left of anything that we would see in Canada today, for example, or even in Europe today. But they were furious when this plan was put forward by the unions.
Right. The Social Democratic Party was able to institute the comprehensive welfare state, and the union density was extremely high, around 80 to 90% in this period. So of course, it's much further to the left of what we have today after sort of 4 decades of neoliberal, onslaught and the defeat, continuous sort of decline of the left, right? But what they were not socialist, right? At least the sort of the socialist that is anti-capitalist current within social democracy were very small. In Swedish social democracy at the time were very small, and so the whole point, right, is to basically use use capitalism and the benefits of capitalism to redistribute to the workers as much as possible and strengthen the workers' power as much as possible within the framework of capitalism, right? And that was their politics. And in fact, the fact that they were in government pretty much continuously for 44 years, and that is, of course, a record in terms of like a working class party holding power in a bourgeois democracy anyway, right? So they were in power, Social Democrats were in power from 1932 to 1976, right? And so that means, of course, they're managing the capitalist state for many decades, and so of course that makes them the good managers of the capitalist state, even as they would sort of try to use that power to benefit the workers within. So there are sort of both sort of ideological convictions. I do think it's a sincerely held ideological convictions that the welfare state and workers' power within capitalism, is the sort of they call it, one could call it a mixed economy. That was the best way to go. That is both ideological and sort of based on their practices as the managers of the capitalist state. So I think that was their position, of the ones who had the power within the party.
A social democratic party is obviously probably largely made up of the, at least in terms of its voters, in terms of its activists, in terms of the people who are going to go knock on doors and so on, and even donate money, of the grassroots of the trade unions. So I'm curious, how did this ideological divide open up between the grassroots of the unions, which are, basically proposing a transition completely away from capitalism toward worker ownership of the economy, of the key pieces of the economy anyway. What accounts for the gulf between them and the Social Democratic Party that's supposed to represent them?
Yeah, so firstly, because it's important to note that it was actually the sort of very close connections between the institutions themselves, right? So between the LO, the Union Confederation, and the party. And in fact, in Sweden, the Social Democratic Union Confederation is actually founded by the sort of party in the late 19th century. And because they are much, much closer than, yes, anything we see in Quebec or Canada, or in much of contemporary Europe, for that matter. But when it comes to the grassroots, right, because I think it is very common in these mass workers' parties, when it's like the Italian Communist Party, for example, or these sort of mass social democratic parties, of course, it is typically the case, I think, that in an advanced capitalist context, the leadership is much more oriented towards closer to the status quo, right, than the grassroots base. And so I think the key issue is that sort of, because the leadership tries to constrain the potential radicalism. I don't want to say that the grassroots is sort of always this, mass of socialist revolutionaries. I don't think that's the case, but there is sort of more potential, right, I think, for these socialist ideas, anti-capitalist ideas to be supported by the grassroots. And so the party hierarchy sort of has all sorts of means to basically try to modify and contain such potential radicalism among the base. And Swedish social democracy was a particularly centralized kind of organization, and I'd have to say, they were very successful in containing radicalism.
And so, do you think that, is there a version of the Social Democratic Party? I mean, obviously they probably centralized for a reason, maybe some good reasons, some less good reasons. But do you think that there's a path for them to be as successful as they were in being social democrats, and also allowing their base to become, more autonomous and self-organizing?
Well, I think it's successful. I think it would have turned out very differently, right? So the roots of this basically shift towards the pro-capitalist position and both centralization. We can see that in the 1920s, 30s. And so there's actually very interesting work by labor historian Jenny Jansen, who has sort of written many books about this, is that in the 20s and 30s, so there was a very concerted effort through the workers' education, for example, through these educational courses and institutions and such, to basically teach them, right, the leaders of the grassroots to become quote unquote more responsible, right, trade unionists. That is basically not to just, strike at any point and not to preach anti-capitalist ideas, but instead were to, train them to become responsible social partners with the capitalist class, and sort of to redefine what it means to be a good social democrat in accordance with that idea, right? So it's a redefinition of what a good social democrat means is to responsibly collaborate with the capitalist class, and so they're very conscious effort to quote unquote educate, right, the worker base in that way in the 1930s, and that is actually when there's a very sort of famous class compromise, right, between the unions and the business confederation in 1938, or the Salty-Burden Agreement, to basically for the both sides to choose this path of class collaboration. And then actually the centralization of the unions and the party is also a part of this, right? Because for the unions to be able to make a compromise with the capitalist class, because they'd have to discipline and prevent the worker discontent, for example, so that they don't go on wildcat strike, and so that they would, when the top of the labor leadership agrees on something, well, that has to go through, right, for this compromise with the capitalist class to work. So that is, for example, when in Sweden at the time, perhaps now I'm not sure, but at the time at least, the workers actually could not even vote, for example, on the union contract. It was decided at the top, and that was it. And so I think this class collaborationist approach and decentralization, they're sort of very connected, and one necessitated the other. So if that did not happen, right, of course, there are many possibilities how it could have gone, right? So, it might have become a sort of more revolutionary force, and, become more successful. Obviously, if you're a supporter of the social democratic mainstream approach, they say that they would say they would fail. I don't think there's any concrete evidence for that, but of course, the alternative did not happen. So, we can only speculate. But what did happen is this sort of, the class collaborationist approach and decentralization sort of came together in the 30s and 40s, and that was the sort of the basis of this social democratic hegemony in Sweden.
Yeah, so if I look at it, obviously I'm not inherently predisposed to being sympathetic to sort of mildly authoritarian social democrats. But if I was, I can see how, okay, you've been elected to government, maybe you've got a few mandates, but you're like constantly managing this chaotic conflict where workers are going off and doing wildcat strikes and all this stuff. And it makes it very hard to like hold things together and implement the kinds of plans and the kinds of reforms that you want to implement, because you're constantly being pulled over to like deal with these wildcat strikes that are sort of annoying. And so, yeah, I could see how you'd want to put some kind of educational plan into place that would, rationalize things to some extent on your side so that you can do what you probably think is the most important thing, which is, passing good legislation, like creating new initiatives. I'm sure there's like all kinds of stuff that they're doing in terms of like housing and social policy and education and new social programs. It must have been just a burgeoning time in terms of building a welfare state. But yeah, I'm just curious what your reaction to that, like, were there any counter currents at that moment? Was there an alternative vision for this kind of education, or was it kind of a consensus that this is, we need to sort of make these new model citizens? Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I think you're right that because the whole sort of structure of the capitalist state, and of course puts a heavy constraint on these figures, right, even at the top. And so of course I'm not suggesting that decentralization and class collaboration occurred because sort of there were, individually evil people or personally traitors. I mean, I think, of course, it's a consequence of these structures of how this capitalist state and, of course, the capitalist global market operates, right? And so I do agree that sort of it is heavily structurally constrained. But of course, but also at the same time, that means, right, once you begin to go down that path, right, that would sort of undermine any potential of such a political force to become an agent to move beyond capitalism, right? So basically, like it's sort of the short-term benefits would undermine long-term goals if the long-term goal is to overcome capitalism, right? So in a way, from that perspective, it is a very self-defeating approach to take.
Yeah, I mean, but it seems like I know a few social democrats, and I feel like they do talk. I can sort of hear what what they would say is, okay, well, you have to be realistic, like we're not gonna overthrow capitalism tomorrow, but there's so much good policy that we can put in place in the meantime. Like, is there sort of a median path? I guess. I mean, you don't want to like, it sounds like they went the sort of route of self-suppression and self-discipline when they could have maybe gone the route of I mean, maybe it's a little harder education wise, but you could have something more along the lines of the model socialist citizen is militant and self-determining, but also strategically intelligent in terms of the kinds of things they take on, and how and when.
Right. I mean, of course, it is a spectrum, right? And I think that it probably even sort of within this sort of broader framework of social democracy, in the sense of using political power, seeking to maximize political power within capitalism. Of course, I think one could say that it did not need to be as centralized as they were. For example, in the 1960s, right, as new left movement and anti-war feminist environmentalist movements, of course, they would rise in Sweden as in many other places. And then there are sort of more, socialist opposition groups and sort of attempts at such, right, within social democracy, which was quite quickly suppressed, right? And in fact, like I suggest, it's probably even worse than cases, for example, like British Labour Party. I mean, of course, which is infamous for, Blairism and now Starmer and so forth. But at least historically, the conflict in British Labour Party has been so intense because there was at least a room for sort of the grassroots organizations to coalesce, right? So in a way that the internal suppression was worse in Swedish social democracy because the internal opposition did not sort of even get to this point, right? But also the other point I want to make is that let's say, right, if the constraints within the sort of social democracy and capitalism is so great, let's say, right, that there are sort of very few choices for them except to class collaborate and centralize, then there would really be sort of no, gradual path to socialism at all, right? Like, so if we think that the constraint is, the structural constraint is so great, then of course the only path would be a revolution, right? So if you want to think about this sort of social democratic path, then we'd have to imagine that sort of these were not necessary.
I mean, so we've talked a bit about. I mean, obviously, you can put a lot of responsibility on the sort of leadership and the approach that they took to try to suppress, countercurrents or sort of upwellings of anti-capitalism within their party. What do you think the sort of more radical elements could have done differently to set the conditions for something like the Meidner plan to be more successful or get further?
Do you mean in the 70s or sort of more generally?
Well, I'm guessing, yeah, in the 70s certainly, but it sounds like, I mean, my understanding from what you're saying is that the roots of this were already laid, in the previous decade, in the
Mm-hmm,
sense that
mm-hmm,
you have a certain kind of education, you have a certain kind of culture that's evolving, and then when this crisis moment hits, and you
mm-hmm,
sort of have to decide, okay, who's going to pay for this? Is it going to be the workers, or is it going to be
mm-hmm,
the capitalists?
mm-hmm,
That conflict is not able to that sort of it, things sputter when that conflict happens because the
mm-hmm,
social democrats don't have an answer,
mm-hmm,
and it seems like the more radical left elements within the unions and to some extent within the social democratic party
mm-hmm,
are sort of are demobilized at that point. They're
mm-hmm.
on the back foot. So yeah, I guess I'm wondering what could they have done differently to set themselves up for more success.
Right. So one is that yes, they could have mobilized more independently, and the second is the sort of the plan itself sort of contained many problems that I think prevented further mobilization. So first, all right. So like after basically the Union Congress right adopted this Meidner-ing plan in 1976, that's the sort of the high point of all this, right? And then afterwards, basically what happens is that there was this endless negotiations between the party leadership and the union leadership. And Anna Hedbury was the sort of representative on this from the union side, and then sort of on the party side, the representatives, and they sort of endlessly talk and talk. And then there was in 1978, there was sort of a compromise plan that didn't exactly sort of satisfy nobody and was even more sort of complex and arcane. And then by 81, the whole new plan was just sort of basically based on this party's proposal, right? And so basically they put sort of, I think too much trust in this internal process of negotiations between the union and the party. And because again, there are historic sort of structural reasons to this. But yes, one can say that they could also have sort of tried to mobilize a bit more independently, going direct with the public and so forth. And it's remarkable, I think, that this is the most radical plan to come out of social democracy, right? There was like no mass mobilization for this at all, right? And so like there were not even like a big demonstration for this, let alone sort of more radical tactics that we could expect from like a plan to whole big plan to move beyond socialism, right? And so I think both the sort of internal party and union social democratic supporters of this probably sort of just were always one step too late and depended too much on this sort of good faith negotiations with the party, I think, which was the major failure. But the other thing is, there were some groups, right, movements further to the left. There was the Left Party Communist, that's like a Euro Communist party, and then all sorts of extra parliamentary movements, and the feminist and the ecological in particular, right? And there were also syndicalist unions, very small, but sort of they were very effective at organizing strikes at sort of key industrial points. And now they were actually very skeptical of this idea to begin with, if not outright opposed, from the left, right? Because, okay, so the union funds would get more power. Who controls this union funds? It's social democracy, right? So in a way, like sort of the further left, of course, had no problem, outright opposing social democracy, but for the exact reason they actually did not even support or were interested in the plan to begin with, and in some cases sort of outright opposed as a social democratic takeover, right? And so in a way, I mean, that's why sort of there was no base. It says each aspect of the base, right, had sort of certain reasons that prevented them from organizing mass mobilizations. If we had seen mass mobilizations for this at the beginning, and yes, things might have different. They might have pushed this other party towards, to force them to accommodate that a bit more. Right?
And yeah, let's talk about the plan itself then. One thing that sort of Joe Guinan, who I interviewed about this, a few months ago, said is that you have, it was good for workers, with a capital W, but you don't have anything in there for, people who are stay-at-home parents or, or sort of other sectors of society that maybe aren't, industrial workers. Yeah, so I'm curious. I'm curious if you feel like the plan could have included more people in it, or if there are any other sort of things that you feel like are missing from it that could have made a difference.
Yes, I think it's true that it was, yes, mostly good for workers. So I would not say just for industrial workers. I mean, I don't see why the benefits could be limited to industrial workers. I mean, obviously, even the service sector as well. It would be taken over for the workers, right? At least sort of in the original plan, so the one of the contentions was basically what companies to include, right? And so the later plan stipulated, the 78, for example, idea stipulated like only 500 workers, so that would leave out sort of most of the let's say hotels and restaurants. It's like much smaller. But if you keep it wide, and let's say most companies included, well, let's say you work at a restaurant, you work at a hotel, and then that would be controlled by workers too. But yes, I think the broader point about sort of the working class and the rest, I think, this has to be sort of construed as part of a broader project, right? I will not say like this is like negative for those who are not working, right? And because it's only negative for the capitalist class and gives more power to the workers, and for the rest, well, how it impacts, I think it depends on sort of how it's implemented and if it's connected to the sort of broader visions. Like, I don't necessarily think it's, there are ways in which it could benefit the rest. For example, if they take the sort of, and they take the dividends to, let's say, whether, strengthen the welfare state, for example, right? Or the sort of the certain voting rights to be exercised by the funds would be voted on, let's say, by the broader community, right? That is another way in which sort of let's say the broader working class, but those who are not working now can benefit. But I think it has to be articulated in a sort of more broader political project. Right? And then also, even for the working class, I think one of the major problems was that it's indirect, right? So that is to say, okay, so the shares go to the funds, and then yes, the grassroots workers get to vote on how their reps on the boards are going to vote for the funds, for the corporate decisions. And so, yes, of course, it is the working class institutions in power, and they are sort of several times removed. And so, even though the grassroots workers did support it, but probably they were not sort of moved strongly enough to sort of come out in the streets, let's say, right, because it was sort of several times removed. And I think that is a sort of an issue with this kind of design in general, right? As opposed to, let's say, workers take over the factories directly, and like if they just have to guard the factory from the scabs like 24/7, then it's a sort of more direct engagement at the level of lived experience, which is just not the case for this kind of idea, right?
I mean, yeah, but that opens up some interesting contradictions. I mean, I totally agree with you that like having the workers directly implicated is going to probably have the results that you want short term. But then long term, it creates inequalities between workers because one factory makes 3 times the profit margin of another one, and so if they're worker owned, then you end up with workers like some workers getting a nice big fat pay raise and other ones not, as opposed, and so you
yes.
you would, there's the potential for an erosion of solidarity over time, no?
Yes, of course. And in a way, I mean, that this Swedish solidarity wage policy, right, was used to counter this kind of inequality, right? So of course, with decentralization, well, one could argue that sort of at least one benefit of this was that it was used to equalize the salaries across the firms, to sort of address this kind of inequality. And then those who are against the wildcat strikes, let's say in the 70s, would say that, well, the world get more at the expense of other workers, right? So that's what the social democrats opposed to that would argue, right? But I think, of course, I do think it has to be a balance. As in, let's say, if we have a plan that involves more direct sort of, worker struggle at the grassroots level, yes, I do think it has to be sort of complemented by more coordinated institutions. But again, one could say it's a trade-off. But yes, I think both. We'd have to have a plan that would cater to both, try to cater to both sort of concerns.
I'm still convinced that it is, as I put it in the last podcast, the wonkiest path to socialism, in the sense that, yeah, it really is like, okay, it really is formulated by the sort of big brain analysts, and there's nothing wrong with that, except that it's going to result, if you can get there, maybe it's going to be the better system, but you're not necessarily going to get there if people feel like it's this abstract, I don't know, whatever the 1970s version of a 100-page PDF file is, like you're not gonna excite people and implicate them enough for them to fight for it.
Yes, I mean, I think that sort of, yes, I not want to sort of exaggerate this too much either, because the once the Meidner and Hedberg released it in the summer of '75, then they were sort of very concerted, again, educational effort, right? And so the LO, the Union Confederation, organized, like, the study groups where the rank and file workers met regularly for many weeks to study the ins and outs of this plan, and there are like 18,000 workers participated, so it's a quite a high participation. And then so they were able to learn what it is, and then at the end, because the vast majority of them would strongly support this kind of plan, right? So these efforts at worker education were made, and thanks to the sort of extremely well organized structure of Swedish social democracy, I mean, they were quite effective in getting sort of mass of people on board if the union would decide to do it, right? And then that sort of paved the basis for the 1976 Congress decision, right? And so in a way, I mean, there was a base of rank and file workers who were, who participated in the study group, and were strongly enthusiastic. But again, sort of the problem is the sort of, is the independent mobilization, right? I think that is sort of what was missing for them. And for the further left, again, like it's it's an understandable position, right? If you're fighting against social democracy from the left, you'd not want a plan that puts more power in the hands of social democracy. I think it's an understandable concern, all right? So we'd have to have a plan that sort of, that's not put all the power in the hands of, not necessarily, it's not actually all, but significant power in the hands of the certain fraction of the working class institutions. I think some of that would have to be changed.
Yeah, that's a great point about the 18,000 workers. I mean, that is a remarkable achievement, in the sense that, I mean, if you try to imagine, a similar effort in Canada, I mean, that's just so far beyond what anything like the NDP would ever do, or even think about doing. Like, they wouldn't even conceive of that. But yeah, 18,000 workers having read a plan, having really understood it, and ready to go fight for it. That's incredible. And so, yeah, I guess on that backdrop, I'd love for you to just explain a little more what you mean by independent mobilization. Like, what, it seems like you should be able to do a lot with 18,000 workers coming out of these study groups. So can you just more concretely just describe what you see as the sort of shortcomings in that context?
Right. So these 18,000 workers participated in the study sessions in '75, and then they all, answered the survey and said we all strongly, about like 90% strongly support. And then that basically pushed the president of the LO to come support, and then the Congress supported. But again, sort of after the Congress voted in 1976, they were sort of waiting for the negotiations at the top level between the party and the union. And again, so because of this very close ties between the unions and the party, they saw it as the, as the sort of necessary step. And of course, the party and the unions have to have a united position before sort of we go to the public, right? That was the sort of widespread view, right? And so basically they, waited for it. And during the period in which there was this negotiation going on at the top, there was not much activity going on, right? And some local unions sort of kept discussing and so forth, but they were basically in the waiting mode. And now in June of 1978, that is when the party would officially come out and say that they did not support the socialist aspect of this plan, right? And then that's when like everything explodes, and then they're angry, and all these rank and file workers, worker militants would basically write these angry letters, and I'm very disappointed. They write letters to the social democratic newspapers, or even to the sort of the bourgeois media as well. And so basically, all this would come out in the open, right? And in a way, sort of, I think it's too little, too late at that point, right? So the party had already sort of said, come out, that they would not support it. And then the sort of the unions and the party again come to some sort of compromise again and again. And then, there are sort of these worker militants saying, well, this was very disappointed. This is not what we voted for. We expected better. But, that's, then so what, right? So I think, it's, we can see that there's a very strong feeling, but that did not translate into an effective political action among sort of these worker militants. And there are sort of further actually institutions within social democracy, particularly the youth group, the social democratic youth, which actually is a sort of very important institution in social democracy. And they were actually sort of, as an organization, extremely strongly supportive of this plan and promoted it. But again, the ways they promoted it were sort of mostly in internal channels. They would sort of try to talk to the ones at the top of the party and sort of convince them at the meetings and sort of have a resolution at the Congress and so forth. But of course, then they'd be further compromised, and that would not amount to anything. So.
Yeah, it sounds like everyone is being a little too rational and sort of. I guess I should also say, like, I feel like I've sort of, within my lifetime, I feel like I've seen this sort of story play out in the sense that you have incredible militancy, like in the environmental movement in BC is one example,
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
you have this incredible militancy, people willing to put themselves on the line. They're really mobilizing. They're doing all kinds of direct action. They're shutting
Mm-hmm.
down industrial projects and so on. And then these sort of big organizations step in and negotiate supposedly on their behalf, but then the resulting deal, but then they're demobilized during that process because the sort of funding disappears, not surprisingly, but also just because that's what's expected, is like, okay, you demobilize so that we can have this negotiation, but it's the actual process of demobilization that makes the negotiation of the bad outcome of this negotiation a foregone conclusion.
Right.
It seems like.
Yes, I think these kinds of processes of incorporation, right, can happen in sort of any any left-wing spaces. But I do think, but maybe the sort of the issues that's facing sort of the North American left today could be a bit distinct in that maybe there are in fact direct actions, right? So but then these direct actions are probably not sort of have no institutional power, right? So in a way, maybe it's the sort of the mirror image of the problem, one could say, is that sort of, yes, I think, we see more militant actions, let's say even like things like the blockade, but then it has no institutional power. And in a way, the problem they had in Sweden was the opposite, as in they had lots of institutional connection, right? So at the end of the day, they were part of this massive organization that was running the country for more than 40 years, right? But then that prevented them from taking any kind of direct action, let alone the blockade or anything like that. So I think in a way it's a mirror image, I think, of the problem.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that we've seen this play out so many times on the in terms of unions negotiating with the NDP in Alberta, for example. I mean, the sort of it was always like, okay, we have to demobilize, we have to, or we can't get too mobilized. We don't want to cause trouble for our friends, in this like nominally social democratic government. While we're having negotiations, but then what do they end up doing? They end up taking effective pay wage freezes, which is not what you want out of the one party that's supposed to represent you. But that I mean, it's a direct result of the sort of union brass saying, okay, well, just hold your horses. Let's just talk to our friends over here. But the outcome is less than savory. Yeah, I wanted to sort of zoom out a little bit. I mean, I'm already started talking about some examples, but I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts. I mean, you've mentioned the British Labour Party, but I guess just as a sort of opening piece, I feel like the big thing about Meidner is gradualism. It's a 30-year plan to like phase out, phase out capitalism, and so there's so much time there for the capitalist, whatever class wants to keep capitalism to like mobilize and to find ways to cause trouble for that. And so I guess I'm I see it as in stark contrast to the sort of, I guess what you'd call like a Bolshevik or Marxist-Leninist approach, which is to say, okay, we need to have a decisive moment of rupture where we seize all the institutions and like recreate society and the economy in a different image, in the image of the worker state, I guess. And like setting aside the fact that in the Soviet Union, like for that to happen, like so many things had to go wrong for the sort of the ruling class, the aristocracy and the capitalist class. Like they really had to mess up over and over and over again for the Bolsheviks to even have a chance at seizing power. But nonetheless, they did, and they were able to. They're certainly more successful than the Meidner plan in the sense that they did take power and they did, a lot of things, regardless of whether you agree with them or not. But I guess I'm just curious to hear your sort of take. Like, do you, like, knowing what we know, do you favor a more gradual approach, or do you see some positives to the sort of lightning bolt approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think one aspect of this is, of course, it's not we who get to choose, right? It's the best or most optimal approach would be depend on the context of global capitalism and so forth. But one thing to note is that this was not the optimal design in Sweden, right? So Meidner and Hedberg did not sort of have the task, did not start from the task of developing this sort of most optimal gradual socialist model, right? They were given a very different task and sort of solving this problem with the solidarity wage policy, and they just sort of took the opportunity to make it into a socialist plan. But then sort of many aspects of this were still sort of constrained by the original mandate they were given, which was not a socialist at all, right? So, for example, the 30-year plan and sort of gradually be the percentage for the workers' ownership would increase. Of course, it's the once the right-wing government comes to power, then one could imagine it could all be gone, right? And so, of course, the Social Democrats were in power for 44 years, so maybe they could imagine, well, if it's going to be like that for another 40 years, maybe it's okay. But of course, it's kind of, you year after year, it could be stopped at any time with a vote, right? So, and then of course there's a problem of capital control, capital right. They did recognize this plan and this potential problem, that the Swedish companies would move away. But I do think that sort of they were not serious enough about how to counter this problem. They did recognize it, but sort of I think they probably underestimated the scale to which the capital right could be used to sort of circumvent, because it was the 70s before this massive financial globalization, so it's a different context today as well, right? So like I think we need a sort of much stronger, better, measures to counter that. So, it would probably have not worked even if it had gotten to the point of passage. Right? It would not work in the same way unless they put in more capital control and sort of the other measures, right? Which is another question. So all I would say is that the gradualist approach, right, sort of has many of these issues. So I think that I do think there has to be some moment of rupture. I don't think I don't think it could be whatever, like 1917. Of course, the global circumstances are different today and so forth. But even if it's not like in 1917, I think this sort of there probably has to be some moment, a takeover, some moment of rupture, even if the rest of it is sort of, I don't necessarily mean like it could be an electoral path, right? It could still be that workers' power takes over majority in an election within in a sort of bourgeois democracy, and they take over the majority. I mean, it could be that, right? But I think the moment of takeover probably has to be sort of bigger. And that is not to say that sort of gradual building of these workers' institutions in the approach to it, I'm sure that would help, right? So that is not to say not to do it, but I think, this gradual approach cannot be the only one if the working class is actually to take over.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess while you're talking, it just feels like, on the one hand, you want the sort of seizure of power to be decisive and sort of immediate. Like you don't want to be like, mm-hmm. Okay, we're just going to gradually transfer the power over, mm-hmm. but you don't mm-hmm. necessarily want to change the form of your economy overnight because an economy is a very delicate thing that gets created with a lot of experimentation, a lot of trial and error, a lot of building of different social relationships. And so if you try to break that overnight and create something new, you're going to end up with probably, just statistically speaking, a lot of disasters. So if I was, 1970s Sweden, it seems like the best way to do it would be to get the militancy somehow, get the militants mm-hmm. in charge of the Social Democratic Party, win an election, or mm-hmm. Get into office even, and then just like overnight, seize the shares basically of all the major industry, but mm-hmm. then give yourself a good 20 years to transition that to worker control, so that the economy remains functional the next day, but you can also have total control over all the capital flight that inevitably would happen once you do that.
Right. It could be 10 years instead of 30 years. I mean, I think if you're actually talking about moving beyond capitalism, then of course, certain destabilization, right, is, I think, unavoidable, right? And so, I mean, there's, of course, the capitalist class always has the power to disrupt. So, right. So, in a way, I mean, I don't think there's any way, no matter how gradual or not, to sort of to go beyond capitalism and sort of have a smooth transition. And now I think there's this political scientist Adam Chbosky's work on the sort of on the valley of transition, right? So basically, that is to say, even if the working class may eventually get a much better situation and material benefits and power with democratic socialism, of course, in the process, there's always going to be a valley, right? A moment, a period in which it's going to be worse off, right? And so, in a way, is it actually rational for the workers to choose this path? And it will only be rational if they sort of take a long-term view and so forth, right? So I think that's correct. It's and there's no smooth path, and I think at least some aspects of this Meidner and Hedberg's idea, right? If it's a bit shorter and if it's more sufficiently protected against capital pride, whether that's possible today or not is another question. And then if it's connected to sort of broader vision, because today, I mean, it has to be ecology, obviously, right? And sort of that has to be the center, but the broader visions of feminism and anti-racism, sort of other kinds of transformations, right? And then it has to be articulated in that way and protected against capital pride and so forth. I mean, I think some of these institutional ideas could be part of sort of a strategy, but sort of not on its own today. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just realizing, of course, my own critique of what I just said is that if you take over the sort of heights of industry and the ownership of big parts of the economy without immediately handing them over to the workers, which of course is going to create a lot of chaos. Mm-hmm. But then you're basically just like a state capitalist owner, of course, and then of course you end up with some of the problems of of the Soviet Union, which is of course very 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 difficult, and then you're going to find yourself under attack internationally, and so you're going to have to of course are gonna tighten your grip as a result, and so and so the question is, okay, how do you mobilize worker militancy, in and sort of, I guess, allow a certain amount, or allow, but like even encourage a certain amount of like factory occupations and all the things that are going to happen with the level of worker militancy that would get you in that position in the first place, without going like Kronstadt or whatever, like without literally just like shooting people. But
yeah, I mean, I think in a way, right? Like, so if like you're thinking about let's say mass party, mass union, right? Sort of taking power in the current system, then in a way, I think the maintaining power, at least in the short term, should not be the priority, right? And because that is not, if we want it to be sort of any kind of a socialist force, and obviously that is not how that is not how most people who work in this area think, right? Once you get engaged in party, of course the power, you do everything to maximize your votes and even get up on the next opinion polls and so forth, because you think, well, once you can only do good, or you can do much better things if you're in power, right? But then, like, we're actually thinking about socialist transition in a way, like maintaining militancy has to be a higher priority. And I think even if it undermines the electoral prospects, at least in short term, right? So unless you have this sort of explicit such an understanding agreement, in the party, let's say, otherwise, I think because it's going to go this way every time, right? It's like once you get in power, or even in the process of getting power, you stifle militancy. You want to be as moderate as possible. That's the rational path, if that's what you want.
Yeah, in theory, for sure. I guess having sympathized with social democrats earlier, I'll now sympathize with the Leninists out there, and say, like, yeah, if you're, it is a very difficult path to walk, and especially if that as a revolution that's nascent and delicate, that if you fail, it's not like you just revert back to a nicer version of social democracy. No, what you're gonna revert back to if you lose your grip on power in that particular moment is effectively what happened to Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed, or what happened to all the post-Soviet states, and that's like a humanitarian catastrophe, and so I think that was always, that threat was always there and looming, and so of course if it means, okay, you have to go shoot up some like militant anarchists at Kronstadt, you're gonna do it, because you feel like it's worth that larger, it's rationalized as, even if it's nonsense, even if it's objectively not true, it's rationalized as a humanitarian act in some sense, because you're preventing this greater catastrophe.
Right. Yes. So I mean, in a way, I think that's why, like, so 1917 style, right? Sort of just pure rupture and that's it. Also, of course, it has these many risks along these lines, right? And of course, centralization in Russia happened because of these reasons, right? So in a way, I think it has to be, you know, a mix of both aspects, right? I think, we can. It's easy to see the sort of, the problems of the kind of model in which it's 100% rupture. Right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think the sort
I
of
mean,
both
yeah, it's
aspects
clear.
of gradualism and rapture would probably have to be sort of combined
It's
in some
clear
way.
that it's an absolute tightrope walk to try to implement democratic socialism under any of the conditions that we can imagine. Anyway, yeah, I wanted to zoom in on one little piece, which sort of strikes me certainly from the Soviet example, because when you do sort of try to take over a state, and you want to implement things in a totally different way that's obviously friendly to workers, then you're faced with the difficulty that, okay, yeah, like it actually takes a long time to develop these sort of institutions. And so to me, like, the things that I would reach for, as in a Swedish scenario anyway, I'm not sure about a Russian scenario, but would be cooperatives, or sort of other sort of democratic economic activity. And I'm curious. I mean, I know that a big part of the plan was probably to set up a lot of cooperatives. But I'm curious how much the experience of cooperatives in the Swedish context was sort of drawn on, um, you know, as part of the vision of how to reorganize the economy.
Mm-hmm. So the union movement, I mean, there was a cooperative movement in Sweden, but I think it was a bit distinct from the unions, right? Because, of course, the unions would represent workers in capitalist firms, and then later, of course, in the public sector as well, and the cooperatives, of course, owned, right, by the workers. So, there, of course, I do think there were good relations, as in that I know the Meidner committee, Hedbury committee, talked with the cooperatives, and they generally got sort of support, right? Supportive position from them in regards to the plan. But the cooperative movement was not sort of particularly a major actor in this. And, maybe that could, yes, maybe, that could have been changed. But, in a way, I think there are many similarities, but probably there were sort of two different models, right? Even though I'm sure there are many things they could learn from cooperatives. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. This struck me certainly in other discussions that I've had about sort of Nordic
Mm-hmm.
cooperatives, and in the sense that they see them as sort of service providers, but housing cooperatives and
Mm-hmm.
food cooperatives and so on. It's just a more effective
Mm-hmm.
way of delivering
Right.
value to workers, basically. But it seems to me that um, that the Meidner plan is in effect basically saying, let's make the economy into one giant worker co-op, in some sense. And
Uh-huh.
so I would imagine that there'd be a lot of interesting visions and lessons that would come from the experience of organizing worker cooperatives that would be relevant.
Mm-hmm.
But my understanding is that maybe those movements at that time didn't see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are probably, one could say, there are more sort of room for collaboration. Again, sort of it's probably, they do not see it as directly affecting them, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
again, these the wage earner funds, right, would be controlled by the workers, the union members, and the unions, right? So in a way, yes, perhaps one of our tasks would be to see sort of how these things can connect, you know, together, perhaps, right? And so, because one difference I can see is, yes, the cooperative movement. I mean, today, it is, I don't know what's the country's the sort of biggest cooperatives in terms of the population of the economy, but it is probably not the sort of, the biggest chunk of the economy in a macro sense, right? So, um, yeah, I mean, I think, yes, I think we
I
can
mean,
sort
I
of
mean, I
try
think
to, yes, yeah.
I think where they would come in is
Mm-hmm.
on the one, like, the workers are taking over at the level of governance. So they're basically replacing corporate boards, and
Mm-hmm.
in terms of hiring the CEO and setting the
Mm-hmm.
overall
Mm-hmm.
direction of the company, and
Mm-hmm.
having input into high level decisions like bargaining and policy and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
But where worker co-ops specifically, and I'm curious to what extent there even was a worker co-op movement in Sweden at that time, or how much it was part of the labor
There was.
movement. But
Mm-hmm.
but they would come in on the shop floor basically and say, okay,
Uh-huh.
cool, we democratized the heights of governance at this giant industrial firm, but now
Mm-hmm.
we're
Mm-hmm.
going to democratize the actual workplace, the actual place where you go and make the decision
Yes.
making at the level of like how you organize the shop floor, how you delegate tasks, like who gets to do what tasks, what
Mm-hmm.
managers, what the role of managers are, how do we even need managers, or how do we conceive of
Mm-hmm.
managers, like all these different things could then be a task for not for unions where you've been in a process of being oppositional to that setup, and maybe having
Mm-hmm.
some influence on it, but now you have control over it. And so worker co-ops can come in and say, okay, well, this is what it's like to have control over that for
Right.
20 years, and here's what we've developed in that time.
Mm-hmm. So for these issues, actually, the Meidner-ing plan had this provision of basically like a worker education plan, right? And they were actually sought to use dividends, like in the initial years of this increasing share accumulation, and to use the big part of the dividends to basically educate workers in the sort of basics of macroeconomics, and then also on sort of how to operate firms in a more democratic way. And I believe the sort of the plan was for the unions to develop these curriculums and sort of programs to train the workers to do so. And in a way, they sort of put it as one of the reasons why it would have to be sort of take over many years. It's sort of like in the process, let's say 30 years, then the workers can get educated in that way, right? And because the trade unions had the role in particular had such a massive educational apparatus, I'm sure they collaborated with the producer cooperatives, as with many other sort of social movement groups and so forth. But the idea was, I think, for the LO to develop its own sort of educational apparatus around these lines. But more broadly, I do want to say that that's right. But of course, then the cooperatives face the contradictions too, right? Because they have to be, competitive in the capitalist market and so forth. And so,
No, without question.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, similarly, right? Yes, it's a problem with this kind of plan in general. Let's say here in Quebec, we have the solidarity funds, right? There's the Fond de Solidarité de FTQ, and then the CSN is Fond d'Action. The workers can put the part of their savings into these union funds, and then they can decide, of course, they can invest in the social economy, and some part of the Fond d'Action does. But then again, like, unless you have totally taken over, you're constrained by the sort of the capitalist, by the law of value, so to speak, right, of the profitability imperatives in the capitalist market. And I know if the what would be best example of the cooperatives to have tried to counter that, but I'd imagine it's pretty difficult, right? So I think that is a sort of common problem. I think that all of these ideas, the institutions face.
No, of course, the same difficulties apply. I'm not suggesting that. It's mostly just
Yeah.
the sort of shop floor stuff, which I think
Right.
is the shop floor stuff. I think is really important
Mm-hmm.
for the long term viability of that project, right? Like you need
Right.
the democracy at the kind of from the top down, but then you also need it from the bottom up, for
Yes. Yes.
a
Absolutely.
project of worker control to be viable.
Right. Oh yeah, for sure. Yes. I mean, I think, and in a way, like it has to be. I think it has to be driven by that for it to work. Right. So, like of course, if this proposal had gotten further, because there need to be a frontal confrontation with the capitalist class, and sort of to win that, it has to be, it has to be the center, right? And if the workers are not continuously mobilized in that way at the grassroots, right? Even if it had gotten a step further, it probably would not have worked at some point further down the line, right? Unless sort of the mass of grassroots workers took it as their own project, not
it seems like you need the worker, you need every individual worker to whatever extent possible to have something in their sort of direct lived experience that they stand to win from it, and also something that they stand to lose if it loses, so that the stakes are there.
Right.
I wanted to move on. I guess just to, kind of coming to the end here, but I did want to ask you a little bit about, what sort of lessons you draw from this, and if you look around at the sort of social democratic parties that are out there, and also just the other sort of left tendencies, the more radical variety, and less electorally viable variety, I guess, what are the key sort of lessons that you take from the Swedish experience when you're talking about those, the general trends of the left right now?
I mean, I think one thing we can directly say based on this historical example in particular is that there has to be more room for the autonomous mobilizations and activities within the left-wing institutions, right? And they should be encouraged, rather than sort of subordinated to the central control. And again, as we discussed earlier, I recognize that that's not the only issue. And of course, the insufficient, let's say if there was none of that at all, and then the other problems could occur. I mean that's true, right? I mean, there's some these critiques of horizontalism in the 2010s. I mean, I do get the point, but I think directly the lessons we can take from this Swedish example in the 1970s, right, is that when these parties and unions, when they become very powerful, but then if they sort of centralize too much and try to contain the autonomous grassroots initiatives from below, even if it might appear inconvenient for those who are at the top, then it's suppressing the radical potential of its own organizations. And I think that's the key. We have to have sort of more autonomous militant activities from below, even if it's against the leadership of their own party, of their own unions, if these institutions are to become a potential vehicle for moving beyond capitalism. And again, sort of if we look at the question of socialist strategy in general, I do recognize that's not the only issue, but I think that is the issue we can take from this experience.
Absolutely. Well, Shannon Ikebe, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything you want to point people to that you would suggest people read on this topic?
On the wage earner funds in particular? Yes?
Yeah, or more broadly, yeah.
I do recommend Jonas Pontisson's work on the wage earner funds in particular. I do have my critiques, which I noted, but it's a solid work because I do hope to write or publish about my work, hopefully in the near future as well. But other than that, again, so there are many. For example, there's a very good biography of Meidner in Swedish, which is very interesting. But there's a problem with translation, I guess, right? And so yes, and otherwise, look, I do think there are many interesting things going on in Quebec, right? So the many things we can learn from, perhaps the shortcomings mostly, but of these funds, and of course, and the solidarity economy, the social economy, and the left-wing critiques of that. So, like from a North American sort of perspective, I mean, not just because I'm based here and both of us are based here, but I do think there are sort of many lessons we can take from the Quebec experience. For those of you in the rest of Canada or the US, that is, I think, something to pay attention to, because there's a lot of sort of interesting and distinct sort of left-wing attempts going on here in Quebec.
Amazing. Well, thanks again, Shannon, and I'll definitely link if I'm allowed to. I'll link to your dissertation in the
Mm-hmm.
in the notes as well.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.